I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody who has come here tonight for tonight's event. John Abrams of South Mountain Company of Martha's Vineyard, who is going to be speaking with us tonight. And before I introduce the person who's going to introduce John, I want to just say quickly that my name is Ralph Maima, and I'm the director of the Marlboro Graduate School MBA program, which just happens to be having an intensive this weekend. Our students are spread over a fairly large geographic area and come here every month for an intensive, where we have face-to-face classes, and then the time in between intensives is online. And so many of the people in the room are students here. But we have made it our tradition that every time we have an intensive, which is 10 times a year, on the Friday evening we have a public speaker. And the speaker is always someone who has something to say about a subject that has a close relationship to our MBA program. So people in the past have spoken about the companies they've founded, they've spoken about public policy, they've spoken about technology, they've spoken about ideas, they've spoken about what they do. And we've had a wonderful series of speakers. I'm sure that this evening's speaker is going to be no exception. But ever since we started in January of 2008, we have had pretty much every intensive a speaker, with a couple of exceptions when we did not have a speaker but did some other activity for our program. And we've opened our doors to the public, and we'll continue doing this. I'm going to turn the floor over to Alex Wilson, who I've gotten to know quite well over the past couple of years because we've had a lot of good conversations and sat on a number of boards and other committees together here in Brattleboro. Alex is a local, and he is also the founder, and I think currently president too. Is that your official title?
Yeah, executive editor.
Executive editor of Building Green, which is a Brattleboro company that focuses on green building and design. I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and Alex is going to introduce John, who he has known for a long time and can say much more in detail about him than I can. I just met John today for the first time. So thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks, Ralph. It's a great pleasure to introduce John Abrams tonight. I've known John for close to 30 years now, I think. I first got to know John when I was executive director, a young, recently hired executive director here in Brattleboro for what was then the New England Solar Energy Association. And shortly after I started, a month after I started, Reagan was elected and the funding disappeared for the organization. And we had to go through a pretty dramatic effort to refocus the organization. And John was one of the people that helped redirect that organization away from solar energy toward quality construction, toward energy efficient construction, and toward sustainability. And indeed, the organization today is the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. After I did a 5-year stint as director, I was on the board and was on the board with John, and we've been on many committees together with that. And it's a great organization. For those of you not familiar with it, they do an annual conference each year in Boston. John is a builder, has a design build firm on Martha's Vineyard, South Mountain Company, which Ralph mentioned. It's one of the most respected firms on the vineyard. Until recently, they had a multi-year waiting list for people that wanted them to build homes for them. With the economy, that waiting list has narrowed a little bit. I might talk about that. But he's very well respected, and builds beautiful, beautiful houses. I've had the good fortune to tour a number of these houses. They're pieces of artwork, really. But John and his company have never been satisfied to just be builders of beautiful houses. They've also done amazing work on addressing affordable housing and the economic disparity on the vineyard, and have some really exciting models they've used on getting the wealthy clients that they tend to attract for the homes to essentially subsidize affordable housing work on the vineyard. I think it's a great model that I've written about in our publication a number of times. John lectures widely. In recent years, he's spoken quite a bit at various conferences and events on business structures, and I think that's what he'll be talking about quite a bit this evening. His own company is employee-owned. It's a cooperative structure. He may also describe some of his earlier connections to this area. John built his first house in Guilford back in the early 70s, and I'm sure has lots of stories he could tell with that. But lastly, just in thinking about what I might say about John this evening, I picked up a copy of a book that he wrote, The Companies We Keep, and reread some of it this afternoon to kind of remind myself what a great book that is. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't have a copy of it right handy to hold up, but it's a really fun book to read and very informative, sort of his experiences in evolving his business and shifting eventually to an employee ownership model. And there's a lot we can all learn from that book. I look forward to rereading it again. It's very entertaining, very well written. So anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alex. Building Green is a local company, but what wasn't said is that it really is the most impeccable source of green building information in the United States. Amazing company. Nice to be here. You know, Brattleboro really is an old home of ours. That slide is supposed to say sharing ownership of the future. If that's what the whole slideshow is going to be like, we're in real trouble here. I hope not. But I really just have a few images. Mostly I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes so that we have plenty of time to discuss whatever you all would like to. You know, I sat in Ralph's class before this, Fundamentals of Sustainable Business, and it really made me want to be a student again, Ralph. It was great, and especially since in my 35 years in business, it's still left me very short on fundamentals, so I got a few good tips. Recently, my wife Chris and I, Chris is right back there.
Let's see if I can tighten that up.
Okay. Had our 3- and 5-year-old grandchildren stay with us for 5 days while their mom and dad went off for the first time. And when they returned, the kid's mom, Jess, said to 3-year-old Axel, she asked if he had had fun. And he said, yeah, Mom, I had a lot of fun. But Mom, it was a very long day, he said. Can everybody hear in the back? Can you hear just fine? What? Okay.
What'd you say?
I won't say it again. So in December of 1967, I was the first person to drop out of the class of 1971 at Wesleyan, and the next fall I came up to Marlboro to visit my friend John Fago, and I stayed in the dorm with him for a few days, and I liked the feel of the place. So I went down to the administration building and talked to Wes Ward, who was the director of admissions. I told him I liked it and asked if I could enroll. And he said, sure, we got some space. And he had me fill out a few forms. This was the fall of '68. So I was in. Not long. Before the semester was out, I had dropped out again. I was becoming a serial dropout. And 2 friends and I started a hippie store in Brattleboro, just a short walk from here. I'm going to have to stay away from this. And nothing of that sort had been seen in this town before. In fact, at that time, that was the only place in Brattleboro you could buy records, except Baker's Bookstore actually had a few Henry Mancini and Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass LPs. But other than that, it was it. And that was my first time in business. So I got tired of the store, shut it down, and moved to a commune in Guilford with my girlfriend then, Chris. And that was the beginning of my real education. It was a time of a many years long odyssey that took me all over from Guilford to Berkeley to Mendocino to Southern Oregon, British Columbia, back to Wesleyan for a little while for a stint, and then back to Guilford, New York State, and finally to a landing spot by mistake, on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Chris and I are still together after 40 years. Our oldest grandson is 18, and essentially we're really doing nothing different than we were then. And in fact, some of our friends from the area, from those times, are right there in the back. What a group, huh? And for 35 years of those years, I've been in business again, and it's been a very long day. And although we're really not so different than we were when we came to Vermont in 1968, the world itself, as you well know, is a remarkably different place. A lot has happened that never happened previously in the long ride of human civilization. A lot has happened that never happened previously in the very brief history of this country. But two new things in particular that hadn't happened before in the U.S. foreshadowed the future. In 1973, during the first oil crisis, we Americans waited online for hours on end to fill our tanks with a few gallons of gas. Never before. There was not enough to go around. In the past, when we ran low on resources, we just moved on. No longer, no place to go. And 2 years later, in '75, the capture of Saigon by North Vietnam marked the first time ever that the U.S. had lost a war. The end of a long reign, over and done, and it meant the whole world, not just this new world, had changed, and it meant that it was time for a very different new world, as many of us had imagined in those years. The trouble was it was only a very few, and so as the rest of the world changed, as we know, America sunk into a funk and didn't. Just a few years before those events, in 1969, Stuart Brand released the Whole Earth Catalog, a book, if you can call it that, that probably had as much influence on my life as any other. I still have a mud-stained copy 40 years later, and on the frontispiece, there's a statement of purpose that begins with the now famous sentence, "We are as gods and better get good at it." I recently finished Stuart's controversial new book, Whole Earth Discipline, an eco-pragmatist manifesto. Has anybody read this book? Not yet? This one begins with, "We are as gods and have to get good at it." And that sums up what's happened in this 40-year interval, no time left to fool around. Not long ago, the International Climate Day of Action swept across 170 countries like a fireball, and I hoped it signified the dawning of a new day, and then came Copenhagen, which didn't go well. $10 billion a year from the developed world to the developing world to help the transition to a carbon-free planet. Matthew Stilwell of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development says, rich countries are trying to exchange beads and blankets for Manhattan. It's a colonial moment. Before the meetings, it was widely accepted that this is it, we got to get a deal done. And yet, yeah, there was a deal, but it wasn't really a deal. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said at the meetings, it's better to have no deal than to have a bad deal. And it's time for a good deal, a real deal, for the good of all. So what does that mean for us? Good evening. We can't possibly know, but we know a few things. I think opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like work, said Thomas Edison. We know we'll have to work very hard in order to tackle the problems of these times and take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. We know, too, that the next 10 years is going to be fundamentally different than the last 10 years. It's not just that we have a new president, it's that we have a new economy and a new urgency to confront climate change, this most vexing problem that humans have faced so far. The next 10 years are the ones that count. And as companies and individuals within them and as students figuring out how to organize our lives, we need to learn what this means. We need to embrace it. We need to work together in deep collaboration to help each other marshal our collective abilities. It will take fortitude, I'm certain, and also extreme goodwill. I trust we'll have enough of each. But we're at a convergence of staggering proportion at the greatest moment of truth for our planet, the economy which is supposed to support it, tanked, and most who are entrusted with guiding it had not a clue. That's not strange or unusual. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith says that the reason for the existence of economists is to give credibility to astrologers. So our country clearly is experiencing more mood swings than a teenager, and we can't rebuild the same economy that we had. It was built on nothing, and we have to build a new one. So as we do, we have to redirect it. We don't need to widen our roads. We need a great passenger rail system. We don't need new financial instruments. We need to begin the reindustrialization of the nation. We need to start making the things we need, like turbines and panels, and fixing the things that we've got, like buildings and electric distribution. The current low oil prices will not last. Now is our chance to prepare for the time when that changes again, which it will in a heartbeat. John Fullerton, the former managing director of J.P. Morgan, says at the beginning of the 20th century, scale didn't matter. At the start of the 21st, it redefines our challenge. The world may be flat, but far more critical in terms of its implications. The world is full, and that changes everything. In his classic 1973 economics text, Small is Beautiful, which came out right at the time of the first energy crisis, Britain's E.F. Schumacher argued that a linked system of small-scale local economies would be more effective, resilient, people-centered than a large multinational economy. I think that's more true than ever, and many of us are working on such things, but scale, too, really matters. So I want to look at that for a moment. Saul Griffith is an inventor whose company, Makani, is working to harness the energy of high-altitude wind with huge kites. And they recently received a $5 million investment from Google. But he is no beat the energy problem into submission with one big solution kind of guy. He's been analyzing his own life in extreme detail to figure out exactly how much energy he uses and what changes might reduce the load. In 2007, when he started, he was consuming about 18,000 watts, like most Americans. It's far lower now, but not even close to the average energy use of people worldwide, which is about 2,200 watts. Meanwhile, the carbon dioxide level is rising. It's at 385 parts per million, and America's leading climatologist, James Hansen, says we've got to lower it to 350 if we want to keep the world we evolved in. But let's talk for a second about leveling it at 450 parts per million, a level that would supposedly keep global climate change just barely manageable, but would still lead to massive loss of species, millions of climate refugees, other major problems. So the world currently runs on 16 trillion watts of energy, mostly fossil fuel. To level off at this 450 parts per million, we have to reduce the fossil fuel burning to 3 terawatts and produce the rest with renewable energy and do it in 25 years or it's too late. Currently, half a terawatt comes from clean hydropower, 1 terawatt from nuclear, and that leaves 11 to generate from new clean sources. So Saul Griffith has done this math and knows what it will take, and it would mean the following, approximately, if we combine the sources feasible today. Installing 1,200 square feet of solar cells every second, second after second for the next 25 years. 750 square feet of solar thermal mirrors every second, second after second for 25 years. Biofuels, something like 1 Olympic swimming pool of genetically engineered algae every second, second after second for 25 years. Wind, a 300-foot diameter wind turbine every two minutes for 25 years. Geothermal, 2 large steam turbines every day for 25 years. It's not one of these that we need to do. It's all of them combined with massive worldwide energy conservation efforts to reduce use. In whole earth discipline, Stuart Brand dubs the land area required for this Renewistan. Nearly 1/3 of the area of the continental United States just to keep the carbon dioxide level at 450. To get it to Hansen's goal of 350, fossil fuel burning has to be cut to zero, which means expanding the size of Renewistan further. It won't be easy. Can we actually do it and build Renewistan? Griffin says it's like the whole of World War II, only with all antagonists on the same side this time. Damn near impossible, says he, but necessary, and the world has to decide to do it. The Pearl Harbor shock in 1941 triggered a vast mobilization that actually amounted to a government-led industrial revolution, an historic economic transition. In a new book by David Orr, Down to the Wire, he says that the global crisis ahead is a direct result of the largest political failure in history. Orr, who's a professor of environmental studies and politics at Oberlin, goes on to say that no national leader has yet done what Lincoln did for slavery and placed the issue of sustainability in its larger moral context and cast it as the linchpin that connects all other issues. Adoption of a robust energy policy is the fastest and cheapest way to improve the economy, environment, health, and equity, and increase security. It's the keystone issue. It's not just another stone in the arch. Time is short, and the work is massive. And to assure an outcome that we can live with, Obama must be the Lincoln of this century. The procrastination penalty grows with each moment, and he's not doing so well yet, right? Hopefully we'll watch him move from symbol of change to broker of change to steward of change. I'm not holding my breath. The results have been terribly disappointing so far, but I do find it invigorating to have reason for a smidgen of optimism instead of just my usual pathological optimism. Hopefully he'll actually become the deserving recipient for the Nobel Peace Prize, as so many others have been. But while our brilliant new president, surrounded by the same old tired advisors and the same old Democrats in Congress, has tiptoed around health care and climate change, and while the brutal and brainwashed right wing has tried to kidnap the future and stalemate all progress, some amazing things are happening. And I want to tell about one that just happened recently, an historic arrangement between the United Steelworkers and the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, the longest running, highest grossing, greatest experiment in workplace democracy in the world. The agreement provides for a new partnership. Mondragon will help the steelworkers buy and start U.S. manufacturing businesses as worker-owned cooperatives. The goal is to reindustrialize the U.S. and make things we need. How many people have heard about this agreement? It's good. I mean, it's amazing that it hasn't been in the national press. Hardly at all. I mean, this is going to take many years to implement, but particularly in the face of the economic crisis that has exposed Wall Street's failures to provide any kind of stewardship of the economy, it's a very heartening development. Together, these two institutions have the resources, they have the technical expertise, they have now the vision to demonstrate to the public that it's possible to structure and run large corporations in entirely different ways than what we've become accustomed to. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is now 53 years old and consists of roughly 260 cooperative enterprises with more than 100,000 employee owners. It's the 7th largest corporation in Spain, the world's largest industrial workers cooperative, and its enterprises include its own university, its own research center, and its own bank. In January 2001, I visited Mondragon with a small group of Americans and for a 4-day examination of the culture of both the town and the MCC. Having used a version of the Mondragon principles as the basis for restructuring South Mountain Company 14 years before that, which I'll talk about in a few moments, it was thrilling to get a first-hand look at this system of worker-owned cooperatives that appears to be unparalleled in its dynamism and its impact on a region. They've created this total system wherein people can learn, work, shop, and live within a cooperative environment. The town, which is really a small city, is in an isolated valley, and it has this vital, prosperous feel. It's a bustling little city with a comfortable mix of young people from the university, new middle-class families and those who have been in the valleys for generations, and the surrounding hills are all verdant, productive, dotted with villages and farms, and the MCC's influence reaches into every aspect of community life. I've always wondered why this amazing story is such a secret in the U.S. It's attracted great attention worldwide, but far less here, and even the U.S.-based socially responsible business movement pays it little mind, as it does the issue of ownership in general. And I wonder, is it the idea that capital is a tool rather than the residents of power just too radical to embrace? Instead of awarding profit and control to capital, Mondragon has succeeded by awarding profit and control to labor in a system of democratic capitalism. It's developed an enduring way to use capital productively and distribute income equitably at the same time. In the steelworkers' announcement of this agreement, U.S. Steel President Leo Gerard says, "We see Mondragon's cooperative model with one worker, one vote ownership as a means to re-empower workers and make business accountable to Main Street instead of Wall Street." Now this is amazing. So Mondragon is going to finance business acquisitions, business startups. Mondragon has not had a close relationship with labor unions, and for decades, unions have all but ignored the cooperative movement and vice versa. But as my friend Urban Crowell of the Cooperative Fund of New England says, for unions, this agreement presents a new opportunity to explore the human and economic potential of cooperative ownership as opposed to settling for an adversarial relationship with capital. And for worker co-ops, this may be an opening for greater solidarity with organized labor. A system of worker-owned cooperatives, enterprises that are assembled with the purpose of the green restructuring of the U.S. economy could be a powerful force. This agreement grew out of a steelworkers project that created a partnership with Gamesa, a Spanish wind turbine firm, to retrofit abandoned steel plants in the U.S. 40,000 U.S. manufacturing facilities have closed since the beginning of the current economic crisis, and to produce wind turbines, like these giant blades, there are 200 tons of steel and 8,000 moving parts in every single large turbines. Those are the turbines that Saul Griffith says we have to build one of every 2.5 minutes for the next 25 years. So Gamesa's connection to Mondragon brought the USW and the cooperative giant together. So while this historic business alliance gives hope to the possibility of reviving manufacturing and the communities that have been devastated by the losses, there's also a whole group of things are happening at the same time involving cooperative ownership. Bernie Sanders, wonderful Bernie Sanders, has introduced 2 new bills that would seek to expand employee ownership in the U.S. The first, the Worker Ownership Readiness and Knowledge Act, would create an Office of Employee Ownership and Participation within the Department of Labor to promote employee ownership, employee participation in company decision-making. And the second one would provide loans and loan guarantees to employees to purchase a business through an ESOP or through a worker-owned cooperative. And in Michael Moore's new film, Capitalism, A Love Story, people all over the country have been seeing work cooperatives and workplace democracy in action. I mean, he presents them as a solution to all of the undemocratic, inequitable, and greed-driven things that he spends most of the movie building a case against, and calls them the patriotic thing to do. All of these events, including the recent UN designation of 2012 as the International Year of Cooperatives, point to an expanding cooperative business movement, which in my view may be an avenue to the large-scale collaborative business approaches and alterations to the whole architecture of the economy that will be necessary if we're to successfully tackle the challenges of climate change and the post-peak oil transition. So this long-term global transformation will require, I'm sure, more than political will, more than appropriate investment. It will require new tools, new abilities, new ways of working together, new forms of governance and business, and all of us will need to own this endeavor and be part of it. A central requirement for that journey may be the ability to own our own workplaces and share responsibility for the outcomes, both good and bad. And that takes me from the huge global wasteland to the tiny garden that I've played in for the 35 years, my life in business and building, and to the idea that our future is a design issue and that we need to redesign our companies to meet the challenges of the era. In 1987, I restructured South Mountain from a sole proprietorship under my ownership to an employee-owned cooperative corporation. And this was a dramatic hinge point in the history of the company. Ownership became available to all employees, enabling people to own and guide their own workplace. The responsibility, the power, the profits all belong to the group of owners. There are no outside investors. There are no non-employee owners. We decide what kind of business ours will be. And the decisions are partly economic, they're partly philosophical. At the time of this restructuring, I was frightened, but I was energized. I didn't know where the path would lead. And tremendous benefits and rewards have derived from that decision for me and the company. 2 decades later, I am fully convinced that this conversion has been a critical factor in the long-term success of the company. Now, right now, my fellow baby boomers own several million small businesses in this country, and during the next 2 decades, most of those founders will exit. So these businesses will either be shut down, sold, usually outside the community, or they'll be passed on. And passing on a business to its employees is an option that deserves to be more widely understood. It offers powerful benefits to the parties, and it's in part a replacement for the family tradition, and it is becoming an important entity of choice. And it's all about the recognition that when the people who are making the decisions bear the consequences of those decisions and also share in the rewards, better decisions will result. It's about building true community within the workplace. So while we work toward political solutions, we have the liberty to invent the corporation of the future. Right now, we can make any kind of companies we want. Nothing stands in our way. At South Mountain, our long-term commitment to the small community where we live and work leads us to expect that the work that we have begun will continue for generations and will never be done, much like the people who worked on cathedrals they would never see completed. But nothing's all peaches and cream, of course. Speaking of Abe Lincoln, there's a story about him while he was still practicing law in Springfield, Illinois, and he represented a client who was fighting the railroad. And a friend coming to Lincoln's office saw a man come flying out the window, hit the ground, brush himself off, and run down the street. And the friend rushed in to see what had happened, and Lincoln said, "I threw him out the window." And his friend said, "Well, why? What did he do?" So, "Well, he's a lawyer for the railroad. He offered me $5,000 to betray my client, but I turned him down. And then he offered me $10,000, and I turned him down again, and finally offered me $15,000. I tossed him out the window." And the friend said, "Well, why did you choose that moment?" And Lincoln said, "Because he was getting close to my price." And the lure of greater financial success is strong. It's hard to forego. And sometimes it comes close to our price. But 30 years after our seat-of-the-pants beginnings, we are still small enough to stay closely connected to our roots, to do business on a handshake, to all gather in one room, to know each other as people, and not only as co-workers, to recognize one another as collaborators in pursuit of multiple goals. Living this structure has shaped a dedicated, skillful, compassionate body of decision makers. Nobody's getting rich, but we are all living comfortably doing the work that we enjoy in the location of our choice. All of us are able to make good livelihoods because none of us is getting rich. So our fundamental purpose has become to use our business to create good products, good lives, a strong community, and to profitably employ the economy in the service of that well-being. Meanwhile, we're stuck with the business of holding ourselves accountable. In my case, that's a full-time job. And I worry that I don't change the way I live more significantly, that I haven't yet internalized enough the changes that must come, the changes that we must lead. Change is hard, but change is coming. And none of us can do it all, but we can all do something about it. And maybe it's more than we think. At South Mountain, one of our goals is to make all operations carbon neutral in 10 years. We don't fully know what this means yet, but we're working toward this still elusive goal. We heat our building and run our forklifts with biodiesel, which we make ourselves. We generate 75% of our electricity with a wind turbine and a solar electric system. Soon it will be well over 90. And in our work, we are moving closer and closer to net zero energy houses. And even our subsidized affordable housing is built to super high performance standards that will allow it to truly be forever affordable. So to reach this goal, we have to keep chugging, we have to keep changing year after year. But we also have to ask ourselves, so what? How does our fumbling little drop in the bucket really matter? And the way is that it gives us hope. Václav Havel, the former Czech president, says this about hope. He says, hope's not the same as joy that things are going well or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Very similar to something you said in class today, Ralph. So this is the reason we do what we do, the conviction that it makes sense, regardless of its modest impact. This new economy will have to be less about doing and making as much as we can, as fast as we can, and more about satisfying human needs elegantly, effectively, thinking about enough rather than more. And we, of course, are only one small bit player of many doing this work. And the many enlarges each day as more and more of us turn our attention to this work, which can only succeed by combining the modest efforts of each and every one of us. Our future is a design issue, and we need to redesign our companies to meet the challenges of the era. We've done the design work, in part, but sometimes reality intrudes on the vision too. On September 18th, 2008, while my co-owner Peter Rodegas was preparing the plans for a large project for construction and nearly ready to begin, we got a call from our client who said that the crashing economy and the threat to his job in banking made it imperative that he and his wife put the project on hold. That was a defining incident of the last year and a half in the history of my company, the first domino in a cascade of backlog diminishing postponements. It was time to take a look, a sobering look at who we are, what we do, what the future might hold. So for 33 years, every South Mountain employee has come to work every day of every week, of every month, of every year, and always had productive work to do. And now, perhaps for the first time, that legacy might be in jeopardy. When the effects of the U.S. economic collapse came, they came quickly, and it became a year of trials and tribulations. Big change and scrambling to stay ahead of the wave. But those same events that made the year so different from the ones before were also incredibly invigorating and inspired us to open our minds, to think differently, to act differently, to dream differently, and to address tough issues that we'd never had to address before. So difficulty and opportunity started to mingle. At times it's hard to distinguish one from the other. Sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. And these times of adversity are when our values are really tested. I once heard someone say, principles aren't principles until they cost something. We're finding that this is true. But now that our values are being tested, where to, what's next, who are we, and what will we become? Tim Brown is the CEO of the legendary design firm IDEO. IDEO's first great prototype was created when the company consisted of 8 scruffy designers crowded together in an upstairs studio on University Avenue in Palo Alto, California. Douglas Dayton and Jim Yurchenko stuck the roller ball from a tube of Ban roll-on deodorant to the base of a plastic butter dish, and before long, Apple Computer, whoops, was shipping its first mouse. Tim is a proponent of design thinking. Every problem is a design issue and can only be solved with design thinking. This is the approach that it seems like is being fostered in programs like this one here at Marlboro, the sense that there's still time, the sense that there's a vast virgin forest of opportunity, and the sense that it's our obligation to design for the future. My generation has failed so far at this, but in some modest ways, I hope we've paved the way so yours can succeed. Part of it is a new flexibility, a new sense of breadth, and a commitment to resilience, which is the word, I think, that will soon replace the tired old word sustainability. I'm very excited about programs like this one here at Marlboro. In fact, in that class, somebody did question the word sustainability too, and maybe that's a good start for this year. One story of resilience and opportunity is emblematic for me of these times in the life of our company. There's a wonderful nonprofit think tank in nearby Falmouth called the Woods Hole Research Center. It's a world-class scientific institution deeply engaged in the study of global climate change. In fact, their executive director, John Holdren, recently left to join Obama as his White House, one of his White House science advisors. So he's got at least one voice of sanity that we know of in the inner circle. But we've admired the Institute for years, and they're expanding their staff from 45 to 60. So to accommodate everyone, they bought a building adjacent to their current facility, a beautiful old carriage house with about 6,000 square feet of floor area. And when they bought the building early last summer, their financial director, Bob Berry, called me and said, John, we've got this building. It needs a gut rehab. We want to do a great job. We want to keep our campus energy neutral as we've been doing up till now. Do you want to do this job? And for many years, we've been committed to limiting all of our work, except for educational work, to the small island where we're located. So when Bob called, we were swamped, and I gave my stock answer, I'm honored that you would think of us, but you know, we got a commitment to working only on the vineyard, and we pretty much toe the line on that one. So we talked for a while, and I wished him luck with the project. And not long after, as the economy began to crumble, and we began to experience our wave of postponements, and our backlog began to disappear, we began to strategize about ways to build it back up. And one approach was to expand our horizon. So I called Bob one day in October and asked him how things were going with the carriage house. Terrible. He said, we haven't found an architect who truly gets what we're doing. We're generally unhappy with the way it's going. And I said, well, hey, Bob, we've changed our minds. We have dumped our commitment not to work off the island. We're interested. It's too late? And he said, no. Let's do it. Jump on the boat and come meet with our building committee. And soon after that, I did. And soon after that, we had a design build contract for a major deep energy retrofit. Let me just go back here. And that's the project. Deep energy retrofit, if you haven't heard the term, is a term you will be hearing a lot of in the years to come. It's about renovating buildings for profound energy reduction, increased comfort, and greater durability instead of tearing them down and starting over. It's the focus of our company at present. Everyone at South Mountain is very excited about the Woods Hole project. All we had to do was tweak our comfort zone just a little bit, knock loose our petrified status quo, think a little differently, and here it was. So, while we busily compromise our values, we can promote new values at the same time. We don't need to wait for our customers to ask. Henry Ford once said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have asked for a faster horse. We need to be capable and reliable guides for our clients. We need to spread this news. We need to share this knowledge. We need to offer new services and keep pushing. It'll take all the ingenuity we can muster to move forward in this new different world. We do a lot of house moving, too, to save buildings people want to throw away and to make them into affordable housing. We do it for other purposes, too. 2 years ago, we were moving a building that a client wanted to tear down to make a garage out of it. And it was moving to a slab-on-grade foundation. So when you move a house, you put steel beams under it, you lift it up, you move it to where you want to put it, set it over the foundation, and then cut holes in the foundation, lower it, and slide the beams out the holes. But on a slab-on-grade foundation, there would be no place for the beams to go. So the building was moved over the foundation, and we asked Mike Reed, the mover, how would he do it? And he says, you show up tomorrow, you'll see how it's done. And our guys showed up, Mike's pickup arrived with his, and two guys got out, and they started unloading blocks of ice from the truck. And they carefully placed them at the corners, lowered the house down, pulled out the I-beams, and they said, you're all set here, and they drove off. 12 hours later, that ice had melted, and the building was sitting squarely on the foundation. Now that's ingenuity, huh? Has anybody ever heard of that before? We had never seen such a thing. So it's our own ingenuity that we must harness and employ to create the future of our businesses and communities. An old fisherman friend of mine once told me that when you fish in this life, always use a big hook, because even if you catch nothing, it's much more exciting to not catch a big fish than to not catch a small one. And it's time, it feels like time for us to go after a very big fish. Our active participation in the doings of our nation are required. In his new book, Come Home America, William Greider says, we have to examine what we've become, imagine how we might change it, governing institutions, political and social routines, the laws and economic relationships we inherited. This is a little like renovating an old house that's well loved but neglected, he says. The process is more difficult than building a new one. How might our country look after we get through these adverse circumstances, he asked. What is America the possible? America needs a deep energy retrofit. Although hope and currency are not the currencies of the day, hope and optimism, I see wonderful ideas and forces stewing at the edge of our culture. A mosaic of new institutions and approaches is emerging. They're here in this room, embodied by this school. And as we unpack these tools, I think we're slowly changing the chemistry of our future. I just finished a book written by Tina Seelig, a professor of entrepreneurship at Stanford. It was called What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. She wrote this book in response to the coming of age of her son Josh, and she was wondering how he would make his way in the world. So she looked back at her life and her teaching methods and produced this provocative manifesto for the young. The reason I read it is because my daughter is grappling with the same issues. You know, where does her true passion lie? What's she going to do with her life? And I thought it might be a good read for both of us. So she hasn't read it yet. She just left for a winter of wildlife research in Costa Rica, which will surely be more life-changing than any book her dad could give her. But I have, and it was worth it. Being in business, says Seelig, should be like traveling in a foreign country. Even if you prepare carefully, have an itinerary, and a place to stay at night, the most interesting experiences usually aren't planned. You meet someone who leads you to an extraordinary place, you have unexpected encounters, and the most memorable parts of the trip are surprising parts that happened into your path. The book was full of other great lessons. I recommend it to all of you who are just making your way in the world. But when I finished it, I realized I did know all that stuff when I was 20. And the reason I read the book is I'm now relearning it. It's this notion of design thinking combined with resilience. And since change is inevitable, the impacts may be dependent on our ability to design creatively and harness the unexpected that she's talking about. The astonishing pace of change in the world today demands new approaches to design, this kind of collaboration that we see in the steelworkers in Mondragon in a way that amplifies rather than subdues the creative power of people. Everything from local economies to poverty to global climate change must be understood as a design problem, and that's your challenge as you figure out where you're headed at this school. I had this, I had an epic dream the other night, and at one point in the dream, a guy asked me to take a look at a piece of writing, and I read the title, and it was called An Open Letter to My Shoes. And I thought, hey, this is what a great title. You know, it could have so many possibilities, shoes and walking in the path that I'm on in the journey and where they've taken me and all that. So I thought, wow, what a great, I wish I had thought of that. And then I woke up and I realized, hey, I did think of that. That was my dream. And so we got to remember, it's our dream, it's our journey, it's our path, it's our home. There's a Chinese saying that is one of my all-time favorites, that man stands for a long time with mouth open before roast duck flies in. We can't wait. There's nothing to keep us from living that dream except ourselves, so we need to be the ones roasting the duck. We need to decide to share ownership of the future. Thanks so much. Now what are we going to talk about? Yeah. Cimbria. Cathedral building. What about it?
Well, go into a little bit of what you said at Pioneers about
Well, there's a,
cathedral builders.
I'm trying to think of this story. Oh, Danny Hillis is, who is the inventor of massive parallel computing, which is what allows us to do all the stuff we do with all this today, is working on a project building a new clock. And it's called the Clock of the Long Now, and it's being built right now. Actually, two versions are being built. One is in the Sierras, and one is somewhere in Arizona. And these clocks are designed to work, to tell time for 10,000 years, roughly the span of human civilization to date. And it's really about getting human beings to think differently about time, to think long term. And one of the analogies that's often used is thinking like cathedral builders who put blood, sweat, and tears into these projects that they would never see completed. And certainly we have become the victims of a culture that is invested in short-term thinking. So long-term thinking is one of those things that is going to hopefully take us somewhere beyond. You want to say more about it, Cimbria?
I was very impressed with the way you were talking about it at Pioneers, because it was changing the thinking. I could feel in the room people changing their thinking. And a lot of what we study here at the school is short-termism versus long-termism. And how the climate of business, which is our phrase, needs to change so that people are looking at the long-term investment and not quarterly reports, but stakeholder reports, and how the consequences of what we're building need to be considered
Well,
in the long term.
You know, it's really interesting. Right now, at this moment, and for the last 5 years, we are working on, in our company, the transition from Generation 1 to Generation 2. And it's an actual piece of our business plan. We have brought in smart young people, and we are encouraging them to stay and become owners and take the company to its next generation, because some of us will be moving on. And it's really given us this notion of thinking about what it's going to be is in their hands and will be in their hands. And our job is not to teach them how to perpetuate what we've already started. Our job is to teach them to think large and to take risks and to make the next iteration of this. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how on the vineyard you were able to get affordable housing wrapped in. Alex mentioned this talent you had for convincing wealthy clients to buy into affordable housing.
It's really lucky that we've done a lot of it because they're not so wealthy anymore. Well, we've always struggled with affordable housing on the vineyard. You know, right now with depressed real estate values, the median home price on Martha's Vineyard is $550,000. So every working person is shut out of the housing market, and we've even had, you know, you can only put long-term affordability restrictions on up to a certain income level. So in Massachusetts, it's 80% of the median income. We've even had special legislation for Nantucket and the Vineyard to increase that to 140% of median income, which is about, I don't know, it's $90,000 or $95,000. Those people are totally shut out of the housing market. So we have to subsidize housing for people that are making $100,000 a year if they're to get into the housing market at all. So there's been a tremendous amount of affordable housing work, but there's very little federal funding, especially for homeownership. Actually, there's only one really big housing subsidy in this country right now, and that's the mortgage interest tax deduction that you take every year. And it's amazing. That's about $100 billion a year, and it is a tax deduction for the middle class, which may be appropriate, for the wealthy, which is totally inappropriate, and it has no value for all of the shelter poor people that actually need a housing subsidy. But so there's very little federal. Our state has had some good housing programs, but they kind of dried up. So at a certain point when we were figuring out how the hell are we going to pay for this stuff, we started to think, well, it's right here. We have this seasonal population that relies on service, that traffics in relationships. I mean, people come, they don't come just because it's beautiful. They come because they have these long-term relationships with people who live and work on the island. And so we started to make the case that this is about community preservation. It's about, you know, people pay lots of money for land conservation. This is about people preservation. And they started to get it. And we started to paint this picture of, this isn't about, you know, blocks of apartments. This is about a mosaic of small scale, scattered site, fits in with the traditional development patterns. That's what this is about. And people started to go, oh, and then we started to make models, and people would say, that's affordable housing? I'll support that. And so the whole seasonal community really stepped up, and it's getting harder now, but it made a huge, huge difference. And now there's just such a rolling affordable housing. There are so many people working on it, so many organizations. Each town has a committee that's pretty active. The Community Preservation Act, which has brought funding as well. So it's just going. It's got a life of its own. Ralph.
Yeah, John, about a month ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Woody Tash.
Uh-huh.
And he was telling me about a program that or I guess a campaign he's behind to move some percentage, for people to move some percentage of their investments into local investment vehicles.
Yeah.
And then about a week ago, I heard about this idea called "Move Your Money" that came from Arianna Huffington, about just asking people, just ordinary people, to move their savings and checking account money out of banks that are, you know, amok or basically
And into local banks.
You know, using taxpayer money for private enrichment and so forth into local banks. And then, and then something else I heard of recently too was the notion that there's an awful lot of pressure in many places to raise taxes to cover state budget deficits and school district deficits and things like that. And the idea I heard as an alternative was to make more of your purchasing local and in-state, because then you increase what goes into sales taxes, and that can be an alternative to tax increases. Do you have any other thoughts about this whole notion? Because this is not socially responsible investment. This is much more fundamental.
Well, local buying, I mean, we know that the multiplier of keeping things in a local economy is very important. Local investment is is problematic in a way, because it's hard to invest locally. There are no local stock exchanges, although Michael Schumann speaks eloquently about why there should be and how we could make them, and it's a wonderful idea. But it's, you know, we have, it's something that's taking hold with us. We have this, our owners earn equity that builds up over the years, and when they retire or leave the company, they get paid out. And many years ago, this number, which was just a number, started getting large, and people started saying, well, where's that money going to come from? How do I know it's there when I leave the company? So we started an investment fund, and we committed to always keeping it at 50% of the accumulated equity. And that money is, has been, for a long time, has been invested in socially responsible stocks and bonds through somebody who many of you know, Christina Platt. But recently we've started saying, well, why don't we invest in land here and invest in, you know, keep as much of that money as we can on the vineyard. But I think it's a very tricky problem. How do you invest locally? Our investment vehicles are by and large centralized. So it's a good one to tackle. This is a good place to do it, right here. Yeah, right just behind you.
Could be a little bit more explicit about how you envision the notion of employee ownership helping to contribute to solving the more global issues that we have.
I think that that one of the big things that keeps us from solving these issues is the lack of equity. That people are that there's huge disparities in wealth. That's number one. And as long as the wealth can be so concentrated, the interests of those who are controlling the capital are not in solving societal problems. So if the people who are creating the wealth own the wealth, you've got a fundamentally different situation and different values. So if people are owning companies that are in a particular place, that means they're raising their kids in that place, they have a commitment to that place, and they own the company. So they're going to want the company to do things that are good for that place. Is that?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
You wanted to ask?
Yes, I have. Thank you so much for coming to our class.
Oh, that was fun.
Yeah, thank you. It's fun for us too. I'm curious, I had a question of how you addressed healthcare within the employee cooperative.
How we do? We just have the best healthcare money can buy. That's it. Because everybody in the company wants to have great healthcare. So that's, you know, and they own the company. But to be more specific, we have really concentrated on putting as much money into benefits, because that's pre-tax money, as possible. And so we have the best benefits you can possibly have. And in arenas that there usually aren't benefits, and it means our wages or salaries are slightly lower. But this is what the people in the company have chosen to do.
And And do you think this model can be somehow adapted to some of the healthcare debates taking place presently?
Well, I don't think there are any debates taking place. I think we've got a truly half-assed health care bill that is going to be passed, and I hope it is passed because it is one hell of a lot better than nothing. But I think that we can all buy health insurance. And so in companies that care about the people in the company, it's not a big issue. It's really about what happens to everybody else, and that's a societal issue that we're not dealing with well. So all of these things, if you wildly and grandly suppose that that we turn into a culture of ownership, an ownership culture, and everybody's owning a lot of these problems will take care of themselves, in a sense. Now that might be glib, but at least the interests are in the right place. Yeah.
I'm really delighted to hear you encouraging us to be creative for a sustainable future around these alternative models. We talked about this in class. And I wonder if you've been in any conversations with people about the new healthcare bill's provision that you could actually be exempt from the healthcare mandate if you create healthcare cooperatives. And if you, given your experience running cooperative culture, would give some advice to the people who are in conversation about creating these new healthcare cooperatives.
Well, first of all, I will say that when is it Kent Conrad, the senator from North Dakota, when he first proposed that, in a state where they've had so much experience and so much good experience with cooperatives in general, I thought that was great. I think that provision. It's funny because I think it's good to be able to do that. I think what it's a substitute for is what we really need. So I don't know. I really don't know if that's going to have any. That if there was a public option, or if there was a single payer system, we'd have something real. But we don't know about those health cooperatives. Are people going to use that provision? I don't know. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I got a question about the applicability of the Mondragon model. It seems like it's very applicable in small companies, 30, 50 employees. I'm not really sure how it would play in urban environments or in companies currently with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 employees.
Well, first of all, Mondragon has 100,000 employees, 100,000 employee owners.
Distributed between.
They are, but some of those companies are very large. The second largest appliance maker in Spain. I remember touring through that factory, big factory, and refrigerators, washing machines, all that kind of white goods. And there was a fundamentally different feeling in that factory than in other factories that I've been in. So I don't think there's any reason why scale is an issue, and we actually will get some proof of this from the steelworkers who must feel the same, because they're not talking about little companies, they're talking about big companies. And it's going to be an amazing experiment. It'll be interesting to see it, and I don't know the answer to whether that can work at scale here. But here's an...
Yeah, you were talking about design, and in the design process, you want to imagine, kind of how things are going to roll out, and what are possible.
Well, W.L. Gore, the company that makes Gore-Tex, and a consistently innovative company, it's a several billion-dollar company, 7,000 employees. It's basically an employee-owned cooperative, and one of the things they have done to deal with the issue of scale is they have kept it. They've determined, as others have actually in anthropology, and that 200 people is roughly the number of people that can know each other, work together as a good unit. And so they make these factories, and they have 200 parking places, and when the parking lot's full, they make another one. And they really do keep it in these units. Yeah.
Employee ownership doesn't necessarily solve issues of power inside of an organization.
You said it.
Or necessarily spur more creativity or innovation inside the organization. So I'm wondering if you can
Well,
talk a little bit from your
those are two big things. First of all, it does necessarily change the power relationships in a cooperative, one person, one vote employee ownership situation. So there are roughly 10 million people in this country working in employee-owned companies today. About 95% of those are in employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, which are primarily financial arrangements. So the power does not change. Now, some of these are very democratic ESOPs, but they don't have to be. Their structure is inherently not democratic. So Gardner Supply in Burlington has just become 100% employee-owned with an ESOP. It's not as democratic as a cooperative. So in a cooperative, the power relationships change. The innovation part, the second part of your question, that's a real question. And there is the possibility and the concern that when you have cooperative ownership and all of these people become owners, that they become protective and risk averse and conservative. Alex was telling me about a company that is an example that was in software and needed to be constantly innovative, became cooperatively owned, and people lost their nerve, I guess, right? And the company failed. That's not the story that you commonly hear, but I think it's a real concern, and the leadership of companies like that needs to be concerned about it. And here's what may be the answer. So, in our company, we learned that people who were employed by this company are very likely to stay. There's no reason to leave. They're likely to stay and want to become an owner. And so we started thinking, well, we better be hiring not people with certain skill sets. Sure, skill set is important, but people who we want to share ownership with, and people who are going to be the right kind of people to lead the company as we go on. So if you start hiring with the idea that there are certain values needs, there are certain kind of creative needs, whatever the needs are, maybe that helps protect against that creeping conservatism. I don't know. We'll see in about 30 years. Yeah.
You have a cooperative, and that cooperative starts because you've got some founders that envision this to be so. And they surround themselves with those kinds of employees, and then they turn it into some sort of an equal cooperative. There are probably some founding principles associated with that, which become founding objectives which you want to maintain. And may be more maintainable because the strength of the leaders that started that are still present in the company, even though it's an equal cooperative. As those people leave, for whatever reason they leave, age themselves out, and you end up with your second generation of string beans followed by your third generation of string beans, which always gets stranger in the next generation. How do you maintain those fundamentals and keep that organization as healthy as it can be?
Well, I think about that a lot, and I suppose that the answer is that if those leaders are as good at leading as you make them out to be, then their biggest task is to get new good leaders to follow them. So that's a real challenge. And I do think that one of the things that is noticeable with cooperatives is that it's easier to have a business with a traditional business structure and convert to a cooperative than it is to start a cooperative, because one of the big things about a cooperative is that the hardest thing is separating what are policy decisions and what are management decisions. You don't want a group of 25 people sitting around drawing straws to figure out who's going to build the stairway. You want the person who's best at building stairways to build the stairway, and you want a foreman to determine that that's who builds the stairway. Those are management issues. And in a traditional company, you develop a culture of expertise, and then when you shift to cooperative ownership, what you do is you empower everybody to chart the course, to make the decisions that chart the course. One of the things that happens as a byproduct of that is you tend to get a more collaborative and more democratic management structure, but it's not necessarily so.